am the Resilience Manager for the North Suffolk Office of Resilience and Sustainability, or NSORS, and I work for the cities of Revere, Chelsea, and Winthrop. Thank you so much for coming out tonight for our presentation on Beachmont residents fringing Belle Isle Marsh. We're super excited to have this project, and this is our second public meeting. Our first was last Wednesday, and this is our Zoom version. We're looking forward to talking about this project with you today. And we will go over what our presentation will be about. So we're going to go over a round of introductions, and then we're going to give you a project overview, and then we're going to talk about understanding our vulnerability, and then we're going to learn from your experiences. So after we give our presentation, we would love to hear from you if you have any experiences or any thoughts you would like to share. So you know me, I will pass it off to Tom, who is Tom, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yep. Good evening, everybody. Tom Skrowski, Chief of Planning and Community Development for the City of Revere. Excited to hear this presentation today.
Justine, if you want to kick things off next.
Yeah, so Justine Rooney, Woods Hole Group, coastal scientist. I'm also working with Connor.
Hi, everybody. I'm Connor Austin, also a coastal scientist at Woods Hole Group.
And I'm Linnea Laux. I'm a climate resiliency specialist at Woods Hole Group.
And Rebecca, would you want to introduce yourself?
She has a no mic symbol, so I'm wondering if she's not able to.
Oh. Rebecca, I should have given you ability to speak if you'd like to.
Thank you. I'm Rebecca Haney. I'm a coastal geologist with the Mass Office of Coastal Zone Management. We are funding this project and happy to support it.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Yep.
So Kristen, you want me to kick it through? So
Yeah, that'd be great.
No problem. So Connor's going to start us off by talking about kind of how we got to this project, how we got to this area, and the other work that is occurring around Belle Isle Marsh.
Thanks, Justine. Hi, everybody. So there has been work going on in Belle Isle Marsh for a long time now, but in real well-coordinated fashion for about the past 5 years. Belle Isle Marsh itself is an open space reservation managed by DCR, state agency, and it is bordered by East Boston to the west, Beachmont in Revere to the north, and Winthrop to the south and east. And the entire marsh itself is a very critical resource for the state. It is actually designated by the state as an area of critical environmental concern. So there is a lot of focus on Belle Isle Marsh for its natural value and the co-benefits that come with that. So there are several species of birds, mammals, insects, there's pollinator species, there's fisheries, there are habitats that are rare especially in the area of Boston Harbor. This is really one of the largest remaining wetlands in Boston Harbor, having our history having filled in most of the past wetlands. But that wetland area that we have today is really heavily impacted. We've encroached upon it with our development, our dense development of these cities and towns surrounding critical infrastructure. There's the MBTA and there's Mass DOT. There are public schools and cemeteries and pump stations and other really critical pieces that are in this coastal zone. And being right next to a marsh, right next to the ocean, we're vulnerable to flooding in this situation. So there has been studies for looking at the marsh, and there have been studies looking at populations, and there have been studies at how these populations can live with the marsh and collaborate with the marsh and create resilient communities. We broke down the marsh border into about 13, I think that is, segments to try to get a handle on flood risk and vulnerability and where adaptation might be possible. There is, in pink, are 2 sites labeled A, because these are projects that have occurred and you might know about from our last year. They were MVP funded projects. MVP is a program through the state EEA program. That's Resilient Bennington Street and Fredericks Park to the north, and Morton Street Resiliency Project to the south. Both of those looking at ways that those critical areas could be adapted to sea level rise in the future. There is the letter B in the northwest at the Short Beach Winthrop Parkway area. That is another ongoing project funded by NIFWIF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, looking at resilience of critical infrastructure and natural resources as well. Then there is between A and B to the north C, which is the focus of this project. And that's the Beachmont Pearl Ave reach, essentially, of Beachmont on the south side. So there are 2 ongoing projects, A and B, in the cities of Revere and borders between Boston and Winthrop. And this project C is looking to bridge the gap between the 2, making sure that the city of Revere, so that the folks who live in the city aren't left out in this little gap here. There are other borders here as well that I'm happy to speak to. There's a lot of ongoing work. There's a big collaborative group of state agencies and stakeholders: Mystic River Watershed Association, Friends of Belle Isle Marsh, DCR, DOT, MBTA, and the municipalities, which all get together on a monthly basis to strategize and coordinate these ongoing projects so that they can be supportive of one another. So happy to speak about any of these when we kind of open it up for questions, and I'll hand it back to Justine.
Thanks, Connor. So like Connor said, we are kind of bridging the gap between those 2 projects. So we have a project occurring over to the east and to the west, and this shoreline here, which we're calling the Beachmont area fringing Belle Isle Marsh, was identified as an area of concern that needed additional study. So those 2 projects are listed here above, and this project is going to look at the municipal roadways and then also the residential areas. So we're going to be focusing on Pearl Ave, Summer Street, Crystal Ave, and Winthrop Ave. And Linnea is going to show us in a couple minutes kind of what that looks like in terms of the residential properties that we're including in our study area. And what's at risk are these Beachmont homes near Belle Isle Marsh due to rising sea levels, more frequent and intense storms, and sunny day flooding. So when we look at this area, there is overtopping from Short Beach, but this project is going to be focused on the flooding coming from the marsh. And Linnea is going to explain for us a little bit more the difference between those 2 types of flooding. And what we're going to be looking at over the course of this study is near and long-term risk reduction strategies and leveraging our knowledge and experience from other coastal communities and projects. So our goal here, our aim, is to enhance resilience, i.e. our ability to recover and to mitigate flooding. And so we're here working with the city in partnership with them. So we're gonna describe vulnerability a little bit, as Kristen told us in our overview, but I just want to identify at the top of this meeting, we're gonna listen to your feedback at the end of the meeting, but it's also really important for us to note that this is not the last time that we're going to try to connect with the community and come speak with the residents in this area. So we're in January / right now we're in February for this project kickoff meeting. We have done a wetland resource delineation and a topographic site survey. Those were conducted by Woods Hole Group staff. And we're conducting now the coastal flood risk assessment. And then we are going to be doing a cost benefit analysis. We are going to be looking at near-term and long-term alternatives. And that community meeting is going to take place in May. And there'll be a final report summarizing all this information. So I have this slide again later, but Linnea is going to talk to us a little bit about flood risk in this area.
Thanks, Justine. So when we think about flood vulnerability, we have a lot of different sources of information, and I'm going to run through a few of those with you and kind of describe what they tell us and what they don't tell us. But I also want to say that the most important source of information that we have, especially for a project like this that is looking at mitigating some flooding that we're already seeing, is your voices, your photos, your videos, and we've already gotten a lot of great feedback from the community about what you see on the ground. So that's been a really important source for this project in particular. But we also have models and regulatory maps. So this is the FEMA flood insurance rate map. It's describes regulatory zones that have different elevations attached to them. And it's trying to describe the present day 100-year storm. So the storm that has a 1% chance of happening in a year. And it includes all the information that we have, all the records we have about past storms in this area. It does not look to the future, so that's one thing it doesn't include. And it does include precipitation and some different sources of flooding, so through the marsh and also over the seawall. But it doesn't necessarily capture some more dynamic processes that can happen during storms. So if we go to the next slide. This is an output from the Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model. This model was developed several years ago by Woods Hole Group for the state of Massachusetts. And it is taking into account future sea level rise, past storms, but also projected stronger storms that might happen in the future. It's taking in the best available science. And the output, this rainbow that you see, is an expression of the chance of flooding for each point on land. So in the dark blue, you can see the dark blue extends into the marsh and also onto part of Pearl Ave. That part has a 100% chance of flooding in a given year. And that means that it's expected to flood at least once per year. But as you go up through the colors, it's less likely. And that pink color has a 0.1% chance of flooding in a year, which is 1 in 1,000. So not very likely to flood at all. This is labeled as 2030, and we talk about that as being as soon as 2030. So MCFRM was developed with a sea level rise scenario that is intentionally conservative, and we've had more information since then. And right now, the way we interpret it is as this could happen as soon as 2030, but it would likely happen between 2030 and 2050. So whenever you see something related to MCFRM, you can kind of apply a 20-year time range, and the year that you see it labeled as is the start of that time range. And if you're a real in depth about these things, this is 1.3 feet of sea level rise from a 2008 baseline. Yeah, that's all I want to say. Next slide. And there's another source of information we have that can help us understand flooding in really low level events or sunny day flooding. So the flooding that you see that's not related to storms, that's just related to high tides where there's certain dynamics happening with the moon and the sun, and the water is getting pulled on more. This can also sometimes happen if there's a storm way out at sea that's influencing us a little bit, but is not necessarily causing storm conditions right where we are. These are the projected mean high water shorelines, which we're in the process of developing for Massachusetts. That darkest blue is the 2008 baseline. It's labeled as present. And you can see that it's, on the marsh where we see it now. That makes sense. The next blue color is as soon as 2030, and it comes right up to the edge of those property lines. As soon as 2050, the projection has water on the road. And then as soon as 2070, you see a flooding extent that might actually be kind of familiar because it's pretty commonly what you would see in a smaller storm in this area. So this is, for this project in particular, a great way to understand flooding that comes from the marsh, and where it goes first and where those, kind of lowest level events are going to cause the most impacts. So this is even though this is talking about the future, it also tells us something about flooding right now. And it's another useful source of information we have when we're trying to bring everything together and understand vulnerability here. And then this extent, so this is pink again, this is from MCFRM, and this is the most extreme condition that we have in the model. So this is the area that as soon as 2070 with 4.3 feet of sea level rise would be expected to have a 0.1% or higher. So there's areas in here that would be flooded all the time, but a 0.1% chance or higher of flooding every year. That AEP stands for annual exceedance probability. So that's just another way of saying chance of flooding in a year. And we use this extent to get what you'll see on the next slide, which was kind of our focus study area. So all of the parcels that are touched by this extent, we kind of grabbed and we said, these are the places where we want to target most for outreach, where we want to analyze vulnerability further. Obviously, this meeting is open to anyone in the neighborhood, and all of our other engagements are as well. But looking at that flood extent, even though a lot of these, houses have never experienced flooding, or some of them may be elevated, it was a good way for us to kind of narrow down which are the properties that are likely to be impacted in now and in the future.
Thanks, Linnea. Yeah, and I think these properties, these show our extent of our study area. So the reason that's important is when we're collecting additional data or we were out grabbing topographic data, we were paying special attention to these project areas. And we did hear from some of the residents when we met last week, like, oh, there's no way that guy over there floods. It's not getting there. And the way that we did it is if the water boundary even kind of touched the parcel, we included it in the study area to be conservative. So as we think about this project and what we're doing here, the most important part is that we would like to hear from the community. And it was amazing meeting with residents last week to talk about their concerns, hear feedback, hear goals, hear issues that they've been experiencing, how they're receiving information. So we want to do all of that again today. These are aerial images that were collected during one of our topographic surveys. And I think it's really important to think about this edge of boundary and kind of where we are along the marsh. An important product of this study is going to be needing to understand that there's not going to be a silver bullet or one singular alternative, which is going to mitigate all of the flooding for everyone. In this area, everyone has really unique needs and vulnerabilities. So part of what we need to do is to provide a suite of information, a suite of alternatives, so that we can kind of have touch points of how we could help individuals. There's going to be people who are already doing preparedness measures for themselves. There are people who maybe haven't thought about that before. We want to think through with the community, where are you parking your car during a storm? How do you find out about if there's going to be a flooding event? Who do you trust to hear that information from? But I think it's also important to note when we're designing and thinking about adaptation alternatives, Connor kind of touched on this when he touched base on the marsh, but we have a lot of sensitive and vulnerable resource areas that we need to be cognizant of. So the marsh as an area of environmental concern carries weight in terms of what are the available measures that we can do related to this resource area. So when we think about this marsh that we have abutting these properties right here, there's very limited activities that can take place in the marsh. So we're happy to speak to that more, but when we're designing alternatives, we need to be sure that we are avoiding impacts to those resource areas. So we're happy to answer questions on that. I think the most important thing probably next, Kristen, is opening it up to the group. I will say again, we're gonna be back in May. So however you found out about this meeting, I would look for the same meeting information next time, whether or not you saw it online or heard about it through Revere TV. You can also email Kristen or myself to receive notification when this becomes available. And one other important thing I wanted to cover, because unfortunately, we've all used so many different online portals. We've used Zoom, but today we're using Teams. There is a hand raising feature. So we'd love if you can raise your hand and then Kristen will call on you in order. The best we can do on order, but that would be how we ask that you ask to participate so that we can keep things organized. I'm going to stop sharing for now so that we can have a conversation, but I'm happy to pull up any of the slides. We understand that this is super technical information that is really challenging to understand. It's nuanced, right? You saw the FEMA maps. Maybe you've seen those before. They relate to your flood insurance, but maybe you haven't seen the MCFRM maps. Maybe you have questions about either. So we're happy to provide any answers to any questions you have, talk more about the goals of the project, etc.
Hi, Jim, you're gonna go first. I'm gonna unmute you so that way you can share and ask your question. Okay, Jim, you should be able to.
Sorry, I just figured.
No,
it
that's
out.
okay.
That's okay.
So thank you for doing all of this and showing us all of this data. You know, I've lived here for many years, and I know you're just talking about Belle Isle, but I would say you're dead on with the sea level rise. My one concern is you're using a baseline of 2008, and I'm guessing the sea levels are already much higher than that. We see multiple storms a year where the water is definitely pouring over Winthrop Parkway and the whole marsh is flooded. And I know you're talking about not wanting to mess with the marsh very much, and I'm totally on board with that. I think it's an important spot for the wildlife, but what types of measures are you thinking about? Are you thinking about any type of damming structures or anything to control water levels in the marsh during high impact times?
Yep, it sounds like there's two questions there. And Jim, thank you so much for participating. Linnea, did you want to speak to that sea level rise 2008 baseline first?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good observation. And it's one reason why the first MCFRM result we showed you was 2030. But so basically technically you can't know what the sea level is this year because there's 19-year tidal epochs, they're called. And so technically you have to average over 19 years in order to find a sea level. So that 2008 baseline is from the middle of the last available tidal epoch when the model was run in, I think, 2018. I'm not sure exactly which year it was run. So that's why they had to take a baseline from before they were actually running the model. But what I'll say is it's just the starting point. So it's those projections and those model results are still very useful. And we just have to understand, what we're referencing from and what we're looking towards. And you're right that there has been some sea level rise since 2008, but technically we can't know how much until our current year 2025 is at the middle of a 19-year cycle.
I appreciate you bringing that
up
up because I've heard other people discuss that before, and I think it's important that people do realize these are also long term effects that go through changes. So thanks for elaborating.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
no
I
problem.
think it's important to note that the MCFRM is conservative and it's used for planning. So the logic behind it being a conservative approach is that we're never under planning, right? We're always thinking about making sure that we understand the full extent. And so your second question, if I understand it correctly, was, is there going to be damming in the marsh, or were you asking about controlling water levels in the marsh? Was that your second question?
I recently saw something that was more, I guess, a pipe dream of an architect or an engineer back in, I think, the 80s or 90s about essentially damming Boston Harbor to control and help the water levels throughout the whole harbor. But I was just curious if any thought had been given to that with Belle Isle. as you know, there's really the main channel where the water comes through. And is that something that could feasibly help some of the folks in the area?
I'm confident Connor has looked into this somewhat. I see you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, thanks.
take this one?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jim. And we have talked about it with DCR, who manages the marsh and the inlet, and that question has been raised before. Friends of Belle Isle Marsh has raised it. Mary Mitchell's on the call here, and I'm really not able to pull the conversations immediately, like directly out of my head. But I do know that the idea has been passed around because essentially what you're saying is put up some sort of storm surge barrier so that when we are predicting a nor'easter or something along those lines, we close off the inlet, and that storm surge that is pushed by winds and waves and atmospheric pressure can't go through Boston Harbor and then come up our inlet here. The feasibility of that is difficult. Not to say it's impossible, but there are really cascading effects of doing so, especially with regard to the environment. So once we start to control water levels within the marsh systems are really finely tuned to water levels. The elevation of low marsh and high marsh, these different habitats and the uses that different birds make of that is really all finely tuned in the scale of inches. So, you know, a proposal like putting a storm surge barrier on Belle Isle Inlet would have significant environmental impact as a result. But I do also recognize the significant flood protection benefit that's desired. So one thing that also kind of pushed back on the idea of a storm surge barrier is that the flooding of Belle Isle Marsh is not coming from just one direction. There's the Belle Isle Inlet, which is, of course, you know, where most of the water is first coming from, but with sea level rise especially, there are other flood pathways into the marsh. There's the Winthrop Parkway, like you mentioned, gets overtopped and washes into the marsh. Those conditions are only worsening. Water can continue to come from that direction. And then there's even from Chelsea Creek and over Revere Beach, looking out into the 2030, 2050 sea level rise scenarios. If we look at the flood maps, you can see that flooding is starting to come in from 3, even 4 directions into Belle Isle Marsh. So plugging one of those holes does not solve the full problem. And I think that is lending us towards looking really instead inward and hyper local, and you know, what is the effect of flooding on your structures and your properties and your logistics, and how can we address it there?
I would add too, Connor, that was really well said. I think one thing with this project is that this project is a result of resident feedback, that residents were saying we need help, we're being flooded. We sometimes do projects where we're telling people about their future vulnerability. Maybe you haven't seen water here yet. This is where the water is likely to go. This is an area where we don't feel like we need to convince anyone of their vulnerability. They're seeing water backing up. They're seeing the tides come in through the marsh. And so a project like floodgates, like Connor was just mentioning, are also really long-term projects. They're expensive. They take a long time to permit. So some of the things that we're looking at during this study are near-term alternatives. They could be as simple as sandbags, right? We talked about this in our public meeting last week, but we did a project across the marsh over on Morton Street, which faces similar issues in Winthrop. And when we met with residents, similar to how we're doing with this project, we were looking at raising the road and what that would do to reduce flood vulnerability. And when we got there and we spoke with residents, they said, that's great, but we'd love some sandbags in our backyards. And so for us, that was kind of a changing moment of thinking about what are some smaller adaptations that could potentially take place that could reduce some flooding, that could feel like they help alleviate that impending doom for some smaller storms. So I think that's the feeling with this project. And I think it's great to think about all of these alternatives, but I want to reiterate that we want to be able to look at some near-term options that are lower cost, potentially easier to implement, have a smoother permitting pathway, etc. Any
Thank
other?
you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim. Any other questions? We're happy to just take feedback on experiences as well.
Yes, and if you have any like pictures or videos that you want to share, we're also more than happy to receive that as well. And Tom, I'm gonna take you off of mute in just 1 second, so that way you can ask your question. Okay, Tom, you should be able to unmute whenever you're ready. And if you're also having any difficulties unmuting, feel free to also use the chat button and I can read out what you'd like to say as well. Justine, thanks for putting in MyCoast. Would you want to talk a little bit about what MyCoast is and how people can use it as well?
Yeah, MyCoast is an awesome platform which was developed by CZM. It includes opportunities to upload photos of flooding events and observations. It also it allows us to see where there are flooding hotspots, and it's a great place to have a repository of photos for any given area. Rebecca, I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to add anything else about MyCoast?
Sure, there's a couple different tools in there you can use. So the King Tide tool is one that you would use for sunny day flooding that's not a storm, just extra high tides or stormwater flooding. And then during a coastal storm, the Storm Reporter tool asks for more information about the details of what you're reporting, the impacts that you're seeing. It's very easy to sign up for an account. And if you have any questions, you can always reach out.
Thanks, Rebecca.
I'm going to share what residents put in the chat. I know that the bottom half of Pearl Ave sandbags do not help as all 4 of our houses and below flood with over a foot of water. So would love help to mitigate the flooding we face at the bottom of Pearl that's 1 to 2 to 3 feet deep, depending on how badly the marsh is flooding. And thank you for the amazing presentation. Thank you for sharing your experience. I don't know if you guys would want to go off mute and talk about that at all. Pearl TV also just added, yes, same for us. We are also by Winthrop Ave in the bottom and flood terribly.
Linnea, did you want to add anything about kind of the flood pathway that exists down there?
Yeah, I mean, the area you're describing is definitely ground zero, the lowest lying part of Pearl Ave. And something that's interesting about that is obviously in 2018, you all saw bad flooding, and when waves are washing over the seawall, you might see even worse conditions. But I'm sure you've also seen days when there are no waves washing over the seawall and water's just creeping up from the marsh. So we're hoping that there's something that we can do to help with those days, at least those days of what we call sunny day flooding. Ooh, Tom, did you finally unmute? Do we have
yes,
you?
I did. Sorry
We have
about
him.
that. I was trying to unmute on the smaller one, and I just noticed up the bar up above that I could do it up there. Thank you for
No
your patience.
worries.
I was listening to NPR a couple of weeks ago, and there was a resident in Provincetown that was getting flooded, and it really was his house. And they came up with
1 to 3 feet of water that is really, getting in the way. So I think that's something we can definitely explore here. We'd have to look at where exactly they could go to connect high points. And I think there's a challenge here that most of the area that my brain immediately goes to as a designer for where you could put a structure like that is private property. So it might require quite a bit of collaboration between you all. But from what we've heard, you're already collaborating quite a bit, and you've got a group chat of warning each other about flooding, and you're helping each other out. So it's great to see that you're kind of coming together over this. But yeah, that's a great point, and something that we're definitely going to explore as a possibility for this project.
And
Yeah,
I think, oh, go ahead, Tom.
thank you. I just think it should be like a 50-50 project between the homeowner and the city, and that the city isn't expected to do the whole thing, and where the private homeowner definitely is bearing the risk and should bear some of the expense, because in a way, this is going to be a continuing mounting problem that, and we can't keep insuring and bailing people out who are choosing to live in either water encroaching or, in case of California, in fire hazards. I mean, there's got to be some personal choice and expense involved.
Yeah, thanks, Tom, for that comment. I think that your comment also connects really well to residents and Pearl TV. When we think about, and Linnea kind of touched on this, there are going to be larger storms that overtop the seawall. These actions that we're talking about are not going to be able to prevent that from happening. But when we look at, I know you said that 4 of the houses, you were using sandbags. One thing that we are going to look at is it might need to be more than 4, right? How many properties would you need to line up those sandbags along the back? This is the type of area where one person implementing a solution in their backyard isn't going to help mitigate or alleviate that flood pathway. It's going to continue to take that neighborhood collaboration. And so part of this work and this project, it seems like this is a really exciting opportunity because, like Linnea mentioned, there's already some grassroots efforts to communicate with one another. But part of our work here too is connecting neighbors together and having these conversations and bridging the gaps and thinking about how we can work with one another. Because, for example, the flood pathway that's impacting the lower Ave of Pearl Ave is stretching across, I believe it's 8 or 10 homes. So these are things that will be outlined in the report. And Tom, we're definitely going to look at those deployable flood barriers and think about how those could get implemented. And like I said, I keep mentioning flood pathways, but we're going to look at areas where we need to bridge the gap. Linnea, maybe you could explain this better than me, but places where we need to think about the stretch of where that action needs to take place. We had another comment. Kristen, did you want to read that or did you want me to?
Yeah, I can read it. Pearl Ave resident shares that I do not flood from the marsh, but all the neighbors across on the even side do, and we flood on the odd side from the underground stream from Brad and Crescent or the ocean. When the water comes over the seawall, the entire bottom of our street becomes a pool of water as it gathers, since we are at a lower elevation than Crescent, Endicott, and the surrounding roads.
Yeah, someone had mentioned the stream in our last meeting as well. I think Linnea was exploring a little bit about maybe where that's coming from, but the elevation component is definitely something that we're exploring here.
Yeah, and this kind of gets at something that we didn't touch on in the presentation, but that I'm sure you're seeing, which is that the ocean water and the rainwater are combining in a lot of cases and in a lot of events to cause flooding issues. So there might be some opportunities in the stormwater system to relieve a little bit of that pressure where you have rain coming down and pooling in the same areas where seawater is coming up.
A question I would like to ask the audience is, when it floods, are you guys moving your cars? How do you know when you should be moving your cars? And if you do move your car, where do you move it to? I don't know if anyone wants to share their experience, but we would love to hear this type of feedback too. So that way, if this is a major issue that you're experiencing, this could also go into some of our recommendations on something that the city can do to like help you guys with your cars, because we know that's a huge damage and expense when that does happen. Pearl TV shares that they moved their car from the driveway to the top of the hill. That's an answer we heard last week as well.
Mhm.
Another Pearl Ave resident shares that they pray there's a spot open by the playground. Is that the playground by the Beachmont school? And residents say same.
Do you feel like you know in advance, or you have ways of finding out in advance when there might be flooding? Or do you kind of, get the text message from someone who sees it starting and you have to scramble?
Yeah, that's another great question.
Residents also shared that they hope there's a spot by the playground. It's at the top of Pearl Ave by Orchard Street. Yes, Jim, if you want to unmute, I think you should still be able to.
Thank you. I was just curious, I know we're talking about Pearl Ave a lot here, but obviously part of Revere and Beachmont is also the Beachmont School, the park there. Any thoughts on trying to help out that situation? Is that situation in dire need? I know the VFW parking lot seems like it's flooded pretty consistently. And even just having access to the actual Belle Isle Marsh hiking trails is nice as well, but they're also pretty close to water level, so over time, what's gonna go on there, I guess, are some thoughts.
That's a great question. Connor, did you want to touch a little bit about, that is one of the projects that is taking place now?
Yeah, absolutely. The VFW and that corner of the Beachmont playground is really one of the lowest points along the marsh. So it's one of the first parts to get flooded, especially when we have the winds coming from the south or east or west. I mean, the ongoing project there is called the Bennington Street and Fredericks Park Resilience Project. It's led by the City of Boston and City of Revere in partnership, and the project is ongoing, funded by the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. They are in, I think, preliminary design phase. This is not a project that we're a part of, so I can't speak too fully as to what the plans are or if they've identified a preferred solution, but they are working towards one. And there is going to be actually a joint public meeting for all of this work that's going around Belle Isle Marsh on March 3rd. I think that's a Monday evening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The city will be sharing, sorry to cut you off, Connor. The city will be sharing information about that marketing shortly. And Tom.
Project fully planned out and implemented in the next few years.
Thanks for sharing, Tom. I'm also going to share some of the comments in the chat. Thanks everybody for a great presentation. As always, Connor and folks from Woods Hole have really helped the whole area surrounding the marsh understand current and future conditions. Let's continue to work together to protect homes and the critical salt marsh. Thanks everybody. Thank you, Mary, for sharing that. Residents share that I'm in a street sweeping chat that texts me about flooding also. Another resident shared texting neighbors. And Pearl TV shared that they rang a few neighbors' doorbells that I saw their cars were at the bottom, and I'd say 39 out of 40 and below to let them know they should move their cars so they wouldn't be destroyed.
That's amazing.
Yeah, this is really great to hear.
Yeah, one of the things that we'd like to explore as part of this is we know that cars can be parked in different places during storm events, but looking into are there options when there are also flooding events? So these are things we're hoping to explore with these near-term solutions.
And what do you do if you park your car uphill, but then there's flooding all around your house? Do you just get soaked and try to get back indoors, or do you stay away until the tide recedes?
I'm also going to share residents' other comment in the chat. We already barely have parking on our street as many houses are multi-family or rent out their homes. And then the renters have friends that live with them and have 36 cars per house. So when it floods, it's terrible. as then those with driveways even move out of their driveway, so it adds more cars onto the street. That's something else we heard last week as well, that there's not enough parking, and then when there is a flood warning, there's even less spaces to work with, and people have to walk a far way to get to their car. And Tom is putting a plug in the chat saying, feel free to share this video with the neighborhood text thread to anyone else who might be interested, because this is streaming on Revere TV's YouTube channel right now. So thank you all for being a part of this. I'm also curious if anyone else has any experiences, thoughts, or questions they would like to ask.
Yeah, I think another one of our question was too, just to prompt the conversation, and Linnea kind of touched on this, is how do you know when to expect flooding? Are you listening to the radio? Are you hearing the news? What are the sources that you use and trust to find out about when flooding's coming?
I think what we heard a week ago at the in-person meeting was that generally people don't necessarily know until it's happening. Is that true for you all as well?
Residents share that they look at the news stations to find out when there might be a flood. And Pearl TV shares text chain with neighbors. It's great to see that there's such a strong bond
Incredible.
between neighbors. I think that's really unique to this neighborhood. And another Pearl Ave residents shares that they check Facebook groups of Revere and Winthrop, which is great.
And this is kind of weirdly specific, but in those text chains or in the Facebook groups, is it kind of people saying, look, flooding is happening right now? Or is it people saying, I looked at the tide chart and I think flooding might happen at this time?
Good question, Linnea. Proactive or reactive?
Jim shares that they use a free version of an app, Fishing Points, that shows tide levels for the area. I haven't heard about that app. That's pretty cool. Pearl TV shares that in our group chat, usually photos are being sent saying flood is starting and pictures being sent. And if I am not home, my neighbors check how bad it is, or we check for each other. And another Pearl Ave resident also shares people post photos of weather predictions in groups. It's awesome to see how much like information sharing is going on between neighbors. I think that's really special. I have a question that we also talked about last week. I'm curious to hear everyone's thoughts about the financial burden of flooding. Like, had there been like any extreme instances where it's been like a major cost? And yeah, like anything you would like to share, please feel free to put in the chat or in the groups. Residents say whenever the new news predicts rain or snow, then I know it will flood. Residents share that has not happened to me, but I know neighbors that have had electrical and heating destroyed. We also heard about that, or like how people had to kind of make sure all of their things that they wanted in their basement or their cellar had to be lifted off the ground to make sure that there was no permanent damage or anything that was really valuable they can't have in the basement. Pearl TV shares that that has happened to our home in the past as our systems are at ground level in the crawl space. Another comment in the chat is, yes, many homes at the bottom half of the street on the marsh side have been destroyed. I've also heard from residents, and also when I went out door knocking, that there's been a lot of new development, like new homes being built. I'm not sure if that's something that you guys have considered, like trying to, I know like one of the new homes have been raised up. I'm not sure if that's something that's also been considered for you guys. Only two, I believe, are fine as one is raised and one is a slab of 5 feet than the home. Another comment is we looked into that, but it seemed very expensive to raise our home for $100,000 to $200,000. Yeah. It is quite expensive. Yeah. Having the money to do that is expensive, and you also have, like, you would have to have a nice chunk of change to just have for that to do it on the side. One answer saying we'll be moving instead.
Yeah, this is all great feedback, and we're appreciative to hear about everyone's experiences because I think it helps inform our understanding of the complex nature of the problem.
Another comment that was shared is, yes, we have 3 pumps going and still manage to flood sometimes. That's a lot of pumps. We only have 2, but always flood, so maybe we should look into 2 more of them. Would you say it's common in your neighborhood that many homes have multiple sump pumps? The answer to that question is yes, multiple homes have multiple sump pumps. Another comment that was shared is also cars at bottom of street are parked at the top of the street or on Winthrop Ave, so the flooding salt water does not get into the car motor and ruin it. I heard last week from some residents that they have had some cars destroyed by that, especially from the 2018 floods that happened. And another comment in the chat is, agree, the folks in our group chat, everyone has 1 to 2, but we have 3. The salt flood destroys cars, so it gets your car moved as fast as possible, and it's very expensive electric bills. I can imagine. Justine, are there any other questions that we were asked last week that you think we should talk about also in this, or any other questions that we've been talking about internally that you think we should share with the group?
The only other question we had last week that we haven't shared yet is, have you made any investments in your own preparedness or taken any preparedness actions? So I think we're curious about emergency kits. I think the flood pumps sound like they are an action that individuals are taking, but obviously Connor kind of touched on this, but you can move your car, or maybe your home is above the water, but then the roadway can be flooded, which makes it hard for you to get out. So are you storing emergency supplies in case the power goes out, extra food, etc.?
A comment that just came up in the chat is, realistically, do you think there's anywhere that they could go building a parking garage that is around half a mile or a 10-minute walk from us at the bottom of Pearl Ave to be able to park that would fit 50 to 100 cars?
From my knowledge, this is an incredibly dense area, so that does sound like it would be challenging to find. I think it's a good comment to put in the chat so that we can definitely think about it. From what I've heard through other discussions, I think the first step is exploring existing locations. I believe it was one of the T stops where cars are allowed to go during
Yes.
snow
So-
events.
The Wonderland
Wonder-
train station, yeah, is open for like nor'easter, like major snowstorm events, but that is also very far away. And if that's your one
Mhm.
car, like that's difficult to get to and from your house from.
Yeah, we're definitely going to have a big kind of brainstorm around parking to see how we might be able to suggest something that could help out with this issue. Definitely a challenge in such a dense area.
Mhm.
A comment in the chat is, everywhere in Beachmont floods by us. And unless they destroy the park at the top of Pearl by Orchard Street and create a 20-level parking garage, which would not work in a space too small.
So maybe there's something around getting people to and from existing parking resources for free that we could look into.
I was just thinking that Linnea is there. If transportation to and from these lots is a problem, we could put that as a note.
A comment in the chat is, yeah, transportation halts when it's bad weather.
Absolutely.
Besides, the 119 does not come past the senior center livings. A question I'm curious about and would love to hear everyone's thoughts about are, besides sump pumps, are there other measures that you guys have like thought about and looked into? I know one resident shared that they looked into maybe raising their house, but it was really expensive. Like, are there other lower cost options? I know everything is really expensive, but has there been any other options that you guys have considered? A comment that was shared in the chat is that they've looked into French drains. Some people already have those. And another comment is nothing helps. Well, hopefully we can change some of that and have some answers that could potentially help you. Even though I know that each home is also unique in how they face flooding and what are the specific challenges to each property.
More specific questions are, is that flooding and where the sub pumps, I assume, are in basements, is the flooding contained to basements or is it reaching first floors?
That's a great question, Connor.
Another comment is moving hopefully in 5 years as every flood is terrible and do not want to see the next one that wipes out the entire bottom of Pearl Ave Marsh side again. That sentiment is also something we've heard at last week's meeting as well. But yeah, I don't know if you guys want to share your sump pump locations and if it's just contained to your basement or the cellar, or if you've experienced it anywhere else as well. Are there any other thoughts, questions, experiences that you'd really like to share or emphasize with us? One of the comments in the chat shares that we are a great neighborhood, just the flooding is hard, especially if you're not expecting it. I've also heard from some longtime residents last week that the flooding has gotten worse over time as they've in their experience.
Interesting.
Justin, do you
Another
want
one.
to share the comment in the chat?
Yeah, another one of the comments was we just lost renters last winter that only lasted 2 months due to flooding. That was another one of our questions that we had kind of anecdotally asked, is we were interested in how many individuals are living in their homes that they own, or if they have renters. One of my thoughts would be that renters would have less knowledge of the historical flooding in the area. So your comment is interesting to think that you lost out on renters because of flooding impacts as well. I would assume the renters also aren't in that handy dandy group chat either. They're not finding out about the flooding. Many homes have renters in the entire home, or some live in the home and then rent out other rooms as shared living. Okay, good to know. Yeah, and one thing that we anticipated is that, some renters might have or some homeowners might have flood insurance. Some renters might not have any form of renter's insurance or anything that would help them if all of their possessions are lost in a flood. And the same resident said, if they stay long enough sometimes, but usually they move after a winter or two, which I would assume is another economic hardship. If you have a rental property and you can't retain tenants, that sounds that sounds like another challenge. One moved away after we had sunny day flooding when it had just rained and we had high tides at the same time. Yeah, I think that gets back to kind of our point of, it's not just, we don't want to think about the biggest, baddest storms, right? Where you're seeing that overtopping over Short Beach. We know that sunny day flooding is also impacting the community. And so we want to kind of look at the impacts from that sunny day flooding as one of the primary focuses of this study.
another comment in the chat is that it's the worst when it floods when it's nice out.
Someone had made a comment earlier that they knew if it was going to rain or snow to expect flooding. But to that point, maybe the sunny day flooding is a little bit harder to expect when it's coming.
And those rainstorms can come and go so quickly. I was on Morton Street, just across the marsh, for a public meeting just like this, and it just poured on us for 10 minutes, and the water came rushing down the streets and pooled at the base, and the road was flooded out for, I don't know, we left before we saw it disappear.
So I was going to reiterate, it seems like the comments are slowing down, that we're going to be available via email, but that we will also be coming again in May to review some of the results of this study and some of the things that we've uncovered in part as a result of your feedback. So we'll be back in May, and there will be a report that's accompanying this study as well. And at any point we can review any of the materials that we've covered. We also can answer any questions. I know it's really hard sometimes when information's coming from so many sources to understand who to trust or where to get information. So Kristen put her email in the chat. That's the #1 place to reach out if you have any questions, or maybe you'd like to know when more information is going to be made available. But we will definitely be looking to hear from you again. This will not be the last time, and we will definitely be coming back to you with all of the information that we find.
Yeah, and if any of you guys have any questions, comments, you want to share any experiences or any concerns you have, definitely feel free to reach out to me. My email is K as in kangaroo, H as in house, O as in octopus, M as in monkey, E as in elephant, Y as in yellow, E as in elephant, R as in rhino, @revere.org if you have any questions or want to send any pictures or videos.
Kristen, I
And
thought you were
then-
going to do the whole email in animals. I was going to be really impressed.
Unfortunately, a Y animal does not come to mind right away, but I should maybe a yak. That'll be the next time I do
That'll
it.
be a yak.
But everyone, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to make it to this meeting. We really appreciate it. Just before we go, one quick question I'm seeing in the chat is how long do you think that it will take until the marsh wipes out 440, 443.39 and below?
You're referring to 44 Pearl Ave and 39 Pearl Ave?
I
I'm
believe
assuming.
so.
Yeah, this is, so I feel like we get this type of question pretty often on projects where people say, okay, well, when is the big one going to come? When is this going to happen? And that's the hard thing. One of the hard things about all of this is that we can't really know when that storm is going to come. That's going to change everything. And, you know, maybe we get, you could call it lucky and don't get a big storm for many, many years. And then it's just, that people have to make decisions based on how often that marsh-based flooding is coming, and how often the sunny day flooding is coming, and you know, hopefully there's options and resources for people by that point. So yeah, it's part of this, the difficulty of climate change and the trauma of it is the uncertainty. You know, we can't really know when things are going to change, and how fast, and all we know is that there's going to be some degree of loss. It's just how, yeah, like someone just said in the chat, could be this winter or in 100 years. I'd say maybe not in 100 years. I'd say it could be this winter or in 20 years, maybe, or 50 years if we're really lucky. But that is what I say to people, like about hurricanes. You know, it could be 2 this September or not another one for 20 years. You just can't know with the lower probability events.
I also think if you're waiting for those larger events, it's ignoring, you know, that death by 1,000 cuts of that sunny day flooding. And I think Connor brought this up at another point when we were discussing this project, that, you know, one thing we've identified through this collaborative work around the marsh is that there are a lot of individuals who'd like to understand when this flooding's coming, especially that sunny day flooding. So it's something that we need to think about how we can help as practitioners in educating what to look for, helping the cities identify how to notify residents or get that information out there. Pearl TV said, doesn't flood insurance only cover up to 150K, but buying new home is way more, or rebuilding, you cannot put a price tag on memories. And yes, my flood only covers that and no content. Yeah, no content, correct. So I'm assuming you mean no contents of the home, none of your possessions. Yeah, and we understand that just leaving this community doesn't feel like the right answer to everyone, right? If you have connections to place, to space, to the individuals in your neighborhood.
I will say though, there currently exist some buyout programs, and the state is working on the possibility of a state level buyout program that could possibly, you know, make it more financially feasible to move. So just so people know that, you know, people are thinking about this, it is in the works. So if people do want to make that decision to move, but financially can't handle it, it's more of a possibility for more people.
But we're definitely not here to tell you that that is what you should do in this scenario. We're really
Yeah,
just here
anything
to
would be
listen to your
voluntary.
concerns.
Yeah, it would be 100% about if someone wants to make that decision, making it actually a possibility versus currently it's financially unfeasible.
Pearl Ave resident says Revere does not care about us. They just want a new Suffolk Downs, and that is where the money is. It's not going to flooding. Look at how much they put into the development because it brings money in. It's not helping our homes and being destroyed. I don't want to minimize your experience in any capacity, but I would say we are here in response. The city councilors helped ring the bell on this neighborhood, L. Baker, Tom. So we are here. This is important to the city. That's why we're all spending our time working on this. I can say us at Woods Hole Group, we also deeply care about trying to find some solutions that work for all of you, especially if you want to stay in your homes in this community. Fixing our homes doesn't bring in revenue like construction of all those new apartments and businesses slated to be built. And then we had thank you so much for everything. So again, we're taking in all this feedback. We're taking notes. We're going to come back to you. We hear what you're saying.
Yeah, thank you everyone for taking the time again to join this presentation and talk about your experiences. We really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, again, feel free to contact me. And I look forward to meeting you all again in May when we have some more discussion points to talk back with you about. But I want to thank everyone again, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their night.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
everyone. This
Thank
wouldn't
you
be
all.
possible
Thank you.
without you.